Hello there, my name's Card. Here on my YouTube page, I like to make all sorts of different videos talking about topics I'm interested in. As I have a few times before, today I'd like to explore a real serious philosophical concept by way of a fun, fictitious example. Incidentally, I do have a real job in academia, but right now I wanted to explain deductive reasoning by way of talking about Santa Claus. So if you'll bear with me, in proper serious philosophy, as it's been taught in the West for the past few thousand years now, arguing that one concept or thing has acted upon another concept or thing is called reasoning. That could mean arguing that objects fall towards the Earth because of gravity, or that you can expect your sea-going voyage will be smooth because the weather is calm. You can also reason incorrectly, like saying, my farm's harvest will be really good next season because I just sacrificed my best ox. Regardless of whether the things you're saying are actually true, this is called reasoning. And there are two main types of reasoning. Inductive reasoning, where you make inferences about the world based on observation and thinking, about what the most likely cause and effect relationships between events are, and deductive reasoning, where you make claims about the world based off of definitional principles. That might sound a bit abstract and confusing. So, for example, if I go outside first thing in the morning and I see the ground is all wet and there's a bunch of dark grey clouds hanging overhead, I can use inductive reasoning to say it most likely rained in the night. Now, it's hypothetically possible that a giant tanker truck full of water came around spraying a big hose everywhere, and that's why it's all wet outside now, but that's not exactly likely. And it's not reasonable to have that be your first assumption of what happened. Inductive reasoning is what most people just call common sense, and having a realistic understanding of how the world works. But what people tend to be less familiar with, unless they've studied this sort of thing formally, is deductive reasoning. It's basically the thought process you would go through trying to figure out if a hypothetical situation or event or conceptual idea is possible. It's also much less about making sensible assumptions about how the everyday world works, and more about being able to prove or disprove abstract statements of fact. For example, it's a matter of deductive reasoning to say, if it's raining, there are clouds in the sky. For it to rain, there needs to be clouds. That's just how the natural process works. This is deductive reasoning, but it's just a very surface level way of wording a natural observation into a provable statement. But where deductive reasoning shines is when it's being used to lay the basis for how we define intangible concepts. For example, it's another act of deductive reasoning to say, all triangles have three sides. How do we know this? Have I personally seen every triangle that exists in the world? Of course not. But having three sides is one of the essential properties of being a triangle. If a shape has more or less than exactly three sides, then it isn't a triangle. This sort of thing is really simple when you break it down like that, but I find a lot of people struggle to apply it properly to real-world examples at higher levels. For context, as I alluded to earlier, I work in and adjacent to the world of tertiary education, mainly in history and sociology. And I see a lot of 18 and 19-year-olds just entering university who simply don't understand the concept of reasoning by way of starting with absolute principles and deductively working to establish what things are possible based on any given suite of facts. Which, I suppose, fair enough. You aren't actually all that likely to be properly taught this stuff unless you do a higher education humanities degree and specifically seek out formal logic or philosophy courses. So today, just as a hobby, I wanted to give a little bit of a primer on the subject here on YouTube. Maybe encourage anyone who's interested to give it a bit more study in their own time if they're into learning about these sorts of concepts. And now, I just wanted to walk through the example I genuinely use to demonstrate how to apply this deductive reasoning concept when you're making a historical analysis, for example. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, and in the title, it involves Santa Claus. So I'll get to him in a moment. And I'll also loop back around to explain why I use him as an example too. See, in the history and sociology and theology departments, we don't look for perfect, objective, singular answers to questions. Nowadays, in education, in the university system, just about the only fields which do look for perfect answers are the hardcore, pure mathematics and physics. In the School of Humanities, we try to come up with plausible explanations for events. We do often deal in facts and points of data which are more or less set in stone, but a lot of academic humanities writing is imperfectly accounting for a particular set of facts, not just declaring things unimpeachably the one true way history happened or anything like that. And you can be creative and transgressive in how you interpret historical data, just so long as you don't straight up stray away from the actual known facts of whatever you're dealing with. Now, if you're an undergrad, entry-level history student, the sort of person I'd most likely be helping to teach or tutor, the main skill you'll be learning is basically how to write a short historical essay. That typically means responding to a prompt in a few thousand words and using whatever sources you've been studying or have been otherwise provided to you to explain some historical phenomenon in a plausible way. Like, let's say you just get given a basic historical fact, like that classical Sparta had no city walls, or that as the Roman Empire went on longer and longer, their coins started being made out of less and less precious metal. Your job then is to explain why that might be the case, and you use your sources to create a plausible explanation for why that might be, and what we might learn about those societies if your explanation was accurate. Now, real historians at work don't just get questions and sources handed to them quite so easily, of course. You typically either go searching through archives of old material and stay up to date with the newest discoveries and theories in the field, or maybe even go digging around in the dirt yourself to find some new historical evidence, assuming you manage to get your archaeological excavation proposal approved by the powers that be. But the principle is always the same, and historical students are meant to learn how to do that interpretation of sources that real historians do in their jobs. However, among new university students, where this general unfamiliarity with hypothetical situations and deductive reasoning becomes a problem is that quite a few people learning this stuff for the first time just seem to get stuck up on thinking that the goal of historical writing is assessing whether or not the prompt itself is correct and accurate. If I'm setting your exam questions, for example, and I include a question asking you to account for why Roman coins gradually lost their gold content and what effects this might have had on the Roman Empire's economy, you've missed the point entirely if your response is just to write an essay about how we know that happened. Doubly so if you try and write something arguing both sides of what the question suggested. The deductive process is about taking a principle we know to be absolutely true, or are treating as true, and then looking at what we can derive from that principle. Deductive thinking isn't the best approach to everything, but it's definitely a good concept to understand, and you certainly can apply it appropriately in everyday life from time to time. It's good to be able to comprehend little hypotheticals and if-then, then-this statements, even though not everything in life is often that simple. And if you want to take your humanities degree in the direction of formal logic or theology, you will absolutely need to be up on this sort of stuff. A lot of the philosophy of logic and religious exegesis and interpretation related stuff hinges on a student's ability to engage with and entertain hypotheticals, especially whenever these two sorts of subjects start getting into moral and ethical principles. because this is where a lot of the philosophical and religious texts you'd be studying frequently do introduce truths and rules and dictums that you need to be able to engage in the hypothetical implications of. Let's say you're critically studying a religious text that says, "Thou shalt not do XYZ thing." You're not usually being asked to quibble over whether or not the text is correct to tell you not to do the thing. The point, 99 times out of 100, is to draw out the implications of, if this statement is true, then what? Not, is this correct, or is this seemingly miraculous thing actually possible? Making this clear is exactly the sort of thing I've realized needs to be worked very heavily into the start of any topic that seriously deals with hypothetical scenarios and deductive reasoning. But I also think that when you're doing this at a basic beginner level, it's worth eschewing any actual religious examples when they're not inherently necessary. Because I think it's just usually best to avoid using many people's actual personal beliefs as examples of hypotheticals. So, when I'm explaining this sort of thing to people in a classroom setting, this is where I use a Santa Claus analogy, because it makes for a good hypothetical setup of the sort you'd get when you're later discussing religion, but without the baggage of it actually being anyone's sincere belief. So you won't offend anyone, and realistically, Santa Claus is a concept everyone knows about, regardless of their cultural background. And I've been doing this long enough now that I've developed 2 different exercises to think through, both involving Santa Claus, that I use whenever I'm introducing deductive reasoning in theology and history courses. These are just very simple questions or prompts that I typically just ask out loud and use to start a conversation and get people thinking. And today, to round out this video, I wanted to share them with you, the viewer. And just maybe they'll get you thinking about the ways you approach solving problems. The first thing I'll do is I'll typically throw something out there like, let's say there are 2 billion children in the world. Every year, on Christmas Eve, Santa Claus delivers presents to all of them. What is one way to explain how he does this? It's just a fictitious, clearly non-serious scenario, but I'm trying to get people open to the idea of working with purely hypothetical prompts. And if you ask this on day 1 of class, you always get about half the students just unable to play along at first. You get far too many people with a mindset better suited for one of the STEM subjects who just don't get it and throw up their arms and say something like, "Well, he couldn't," or "Santa isn't real." Even if you explain that it's an abstract creative thinking exercise, you inevitably still get a few people who even try to break down the math of it all and tell you that, actually, even if the act of dropping off the presents itself took no time, no one person could move fast enough to reach every child's home over the entire world, or something like that. But that's missing the point. When you get a question like this, the right thing to do is to acknowledge the stipulation that, in this case, Santa does deliver presents to that many children. And in practice, I will keep harping on this point until everyone in the classroom understands that. Every time you make someone understand this in the classroom is hopefully a time they won't make that same mistake on an exam or an essay or in real life. And incidentally, the best response I ever heard to the Santa prompt was from a more STEM-ish student, who fortunately didn't make the same mistake many of the others tend to make. And they suggested, very creatively, that even though there's only one Santa Claus, perhaps he's capable of delivering presents to every household simultaneously. But he exists in a quantum state that, if observed, ceases to exist, which explains how he's able to deliver presents forever, but no one's ever seen him. And I think that's a fantastic response, because it clearly demonstrates that the student who said it understands the spirit of the question. And it's so good, in fact, ever since I've always thought of this prompt from then on as the quantum state Santa example. Another similar setup I've used for history classes is to play a few minutes from the Flintstones Christmas special. Another great thing about something like the Flintstones is that it's just one of those pop culture things everyone already knows the premise of, even if you can't recall ever actually watching it. We all know it's a cartoon about caveman times. And I play some of this Christmas special where the characters, cavemen, are talking about Christmas and Santa Claus. Now, I would put it to you that this would appear highly anachronistic. How would early cave-dwelling man know about Christmas, let alone Santa Claus? And again, I just open up the discussion looking for any answers that might explain that. If you say, well, they couldn't know about Santa Claus, it's chronologically impossible, I say, you're wrong, because our source just showed them doing exactly that. I'm looking for someone to say, well, if we take it as granted that Christmas wasn't a thing until at least the 1st century, and the Flintstones do know about Christmas, the only solution is that we have to rethink when the Flintstones is set. That's basically the only thing you can do in this sort of situation. This isn't a serious example, of course, but it's the perfect way to start talking about how we, in the field of history, have to make our theories fit with the facts of the source and not the other way around. Sometimes we do discover stuff that upends our prior thinking, and we have to integrate that new knowledge rather than just ignore it. Once upon a time, if you told the foremost historical scholars in the world that you found a 2nd century Viking coin in the ruins of 15th century Constantinople, they'd laugh you out of the room. But now, we found exactly that, and we have to explain how that can be. Or say, if we're working in early anthropology, doing fieldwork excavations, and it's the current consensus position in the discipline that the first man-made artworks emerged 40,000 years ago, and you're digging in a layer of dirt that's 50,000 years old, and you find new man-made rock paintings, you can't just say the evidence is wrong. You have to reshape your understanding. I hope that gives you something interesting to think about. It's just a little look at the sort of thinking we try to teach in the humanities department, and why we teach that sort of thinking over just pure puzzle solving and numbers crunching. That's all from me this time. Once again, my name's Card. If you might want to hear more from me, feel free to subscribe to this YouTube page, or just take a look at my other videos. Either way, goodbye for now, and have a lovely day.